The security footage would later show the exact moment Marcus Bennett's life changed forever. Though at 11:47 p.m. on a rain-soaked Tuesday in March, nobody watching the monitors at JFK Terminal 5 had any idea they were witnessing the opening act of a corporate earthquake that would reshape American aviation. The timestamp burned white in the corner of the frame as a tall black man in a charcoal hoodie moved through the terminal with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent half his adult life in airports. His messenger bag slung across one shoulder and exhaustion written into every line of his face. London had been brutal. 48 hours of negotiations compressed into conference rooms that smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Lawyers circling contract clauses like sharks around wounded prey. Investment bankers running numbers that made Marcus's head pound even now, as he walked past shuttered Hudson News kiosks and darkened gate areas. The acquisition papers for Skylink Airways sat in a secure server somewhere beneath the streets of the City of London. Digital signatures still warm. $2.1 billion transferred between accounts in the time it took most people to brew their morning coffee. The deal had closed at 6 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which meant Marcus had officially owned an entire airline for exactly 17 hours and 47 minutes, though the irony of that fact wouldn't become apparent for another 33 minutes. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that airports used to convince travelers it was still daytime regardless of what the sky outside might suggest. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, with the kind of intensity that turned runway lights into abstract art, red and white streaks bleeding together like watercolors left out in a storm. Marcus felt every one of his 42 years pressing down on his shoulders as he approached the check-in counter for Skylink Airways. Flight 2847 to Chicago, the same route he'd flown 100 times before, though never as the man who signed the paychecks of everyone wearing the navy blue uniform with its distinctive silver wing logo. The gate agent looked up from her computer screen with the kind of professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her name tag identifying her as Jennifer. And for exactly 3 seconds, Marcus thought this might go smoothly. Then her gaze traveled from his face to his hoodie to the boarding pass he'd pulled up on his phone, and something shifted in her expression, a microscopic tightening around her mouth that he'd learned to recognize the way meteorologists recognize storm patterns. "Sir, can I verify this is actually your reservation?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Marcus had booked the seat exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes ago from a black car crawling through London traffic, his thumb stabbing at the Skylink app while his CFO rattled off integration timelines in his head of legal fielded calls from the FAA. Seat 1A, first class, $6,800 charged to an American Express black card that weighed more than most people's wallets. The confirmation email had arrived within seconds. Everything processed through systems that would, in approximately 14 hours, begin displaying his name at the top of every organizational chart, every chain of command, every single document that mattered. "Yes, I booked it a few hours ago. Marcus Bennett, seat 1A. Jennifer's fingers moved across her keyboard with deliberate slowness, her eyes narrowing at whatever she saw on the screen, though Marcus knew exactly what was there because he'd designed half the back-end systems that powered it during a consulting contract 6 years ago, back when Skylink was just another potential acquisition target, and he was just another tech entrepreneur looking for inefficiencies to exploit. "I'm going to need to call a supervisor. Just one moment, please." The words carried the weight of 1,000 similar interactions stretching back through Marcus's entire adult life. That particular combination of excessive caution and thinly veiled suspicion that appeared whenever he didn't match someone's mental image of what a first-class passenger should look like. He could have pulled out the Amex Black, could have mentioned that he'd flown enough miles on this carrier to circle the Earth 11 times, could have done any number of things to shortcut this conversation. Instead, he checked his watch and waited because somewhere in the back of his mind a different memory was stirring, dusty and painful and 23 years old. The supervisor arrived with a tablet tucked under her arm and concern etched into the lines around her eyes, her name tag reading Patricia, shift lead. She studied Marcus's boarding pass for what felt like an eternity, then typed something into her tablet, then looked at Jennifer, then looked back at Marcus with an expression that suggested she was trying to solve a puzzle missing several crucial pieces. "Mr. Bennett, I apologize for the delay. We're just verifying some details in our system. Have you flown first class with Skylink before?" The question was polite on its surface, reasonable even, the kind of thing any airline employee might ask. But Marcus had been navigating these waters long enough to recognize the subtext, the implication that perhaps this was all some kind of mistake or misunderstanding, that someone like him in worn jeans and a hoodie that had seen better days couldn't possibly belong in the front cabin where senators and CEOs sipped complimentary champagne. Many times. "Is there a specific problem with my reservation?" Patricia's smile never wavered, professional to the core, though her fingers kept moving across the tablet screen like she was searching for something that would make sense of the situation. Behind Marcus, a line was forming. Other late-night travelers with places to be and patience running thin, though nobody said anything yet because this was still within the acceptable bounds of normal airport dysfunction. "No problem at all, sir. Just following our verification procedures. Jennifer, go ahead and process Mr. Bennett through." The boarding pass printed with a series of mechanical clicks, thick cardstock embossed with gold lettering that marked him as one of Skylink's most elite frequent flyers, though the irony of that status would become apparent soon enough. Marcus took it without comment and moved toward security, aware of the eyes following him, aware of the whispered conversation that started the moment he was out of earshot. He'd been that conversation topic more times than he could count, in hotel lobbies and restaurant waiting areas and rental car counters. Always the same pattern of excessive scrutiny followed by reluctant acceptance once his credentials checked out. The TSA checkpoint was a study in controlled chaos even at this hour. Travelers shuffling through in their socks and jackets piled high in gray plastic bins, the whole machinery of American security theater grinding forward with bureaucratic inevitability. Marcus had TSA pre-check, had clear, had every possible shortcut that money and frequent travel could buy. But the officer manning the document check still held his boarding pass up to the light like he was examining currency for counterfeits. "Going to Chicago?" "Yes." "Business or pleasure?" The question hit Marcus wrong, fatigue making him less diplomatic than usual, because what possible difference could it make to this man in his polyester uniform whether Marcus was traveling to close billion-dollar deals or visit dying relatives? But he swallowed the irritation and kept his voice level, kept everything smooth and professional, because that was the cost of moving through the world in his particular skin. "Business." He made it through the metal detector without incident, grabbed his bag from the conveyor belt, and was halfway to rebuckling his belt when the TSA officer called out from behind the scanner, "Sir, we need to do a random additional screening." Marcus froze. He'd been through enough airports to know what random meant, had seen the statistics on how certain demographics got randomly selected at rates that defied mathematical probability. His bag sat on the stainless steel table under harsh LED lights as another officer appeared, this one younger, maybe 25, with hands that moved through Marcus's belongings with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for international smugglers. The laptop came out first, a custom-built machine worth more than 3 months of this kid's salary, then the chargers and cables, then the leather portfolio containing documents that would mean nothing to anyone without the context to understand them. The officer held up the Amex Black Card like it was an artifact from another civilization, turning it over in his hands while his partner looked on with undisguised skepticism. "This is yours, sir?" Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest, some combination of rage and resignation that he'd been feeling since he was 19 years old, and this exact pattern had first embedded itself in his nervous system. The TSA officer was waiting for an answer, the card still held up between thumb and forefinger, and behind them the other travelers moved through without a second glance, without random screenings, without anyone questioning whether their credit cards actually belong to them. "Yes, Marcus Bennett. It's on the card." The younger officer's eyes flicked to the name embossed in the platinum, then to Marcus's face, then to his partner, some silent communication passing between them that Marcus couldn't quite read, but understood perfectly well in its implications. Eventually, reluctantly, the card went back in his wallet. The laptop went back in his bag, and Marcus was waved through with a tight nod that carried no apology. No acknowledgement that the last 15 minutes had been anything other than standard procedure. He found a quiet corner near Gate 12 and collapsed into one of those airport chairs designed by people who'd apparently never sat in one. His messenger bag on the floor between his feet and his phone already buzzing with messages from people who thought midnight was a perfectly reasonable time to demand his attention. The CFO wanted to know about integration timelines. The head of HR had questions about retention packages for senior Skylink executives. His lawyer needed signatures on documents that couldn't possibly wait until morning, as if the entire legal framework of American corporate law might collapse if Marcus didn't initial 3 more paragraphs before sunrise. He ignored all of it and pulled up a different app instead, one he'd coded himself during a weekend 3 months ago when the Skylink acquisition had shifted from theoretical possibility to probable reality. The app monitored complaint databases across the airline industry, looking for patterns, watching for red flags, analyzing customer service incidents with the kind of algorithmic precision that most companies never bothered to apply to their own operations. What it showed him made his jaw tighten. 47 complaints in the past 18 months, all filed against Skylink Airways, all involving passengers of color being questioned about their right to occupy first-class seats. Some had been resolved with apologies and travel vouchers. Most had been dismissed as misunderstandings or failures to follow proper procedure. A few had escalated to the point where security had been called, where paying customers had been escorted off aircraft, where the fundamental premise of equal service had broken down so completely that people had retained lawyers and filed lawsuits that Skylink's legal team had quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements attached. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who cared to look, which apparently had not included the previous ownership or the board of directors or anyone else in a position to actually fix the problem. Marcus had spent 18 months doing due diligence on this acquisition, studying balance sheets and route profitability and fuel efficiency metrics. But he'd also been studying this, watching the complaint data accumulate like water behind a cracking dam. He'd known buying Skylink meant buying its problems, inheriting its culture, taking responsibility for systems that had been failing people who looked like him for longer than he'd been alive. But he hadn't realized he'd be testing those systems personally quite this soon. The decision crystallized somewhere between reading the complaint data and checking the time remaining before boarding. Marcus could have changed clothes in the airport bathroom, could have pulled the tailored suit from his carry-on and transformed himself into something more palatable to whatever prejudices might be waiting on the other end of that jet bridge. He'd done it before, that particular performance of respectability politics, dressing himself in armor made of expensive fabric and designer labels until the people around him felt comfortable enough to treat him like a human being. Tonight, though, exhaustion made him reckless. Tonight, the hoodie stayed on, the jeans stayed faded, the sneakers stayed scuffed. Tonight, Marcus Bennett was going to board his own airline dressed like a graduate student and see exactly what happened, because if the culture was broken enough to fail a random passenger, it needed to be exposed before it failed someone who didn't have the resources to fight back. The gate area began filling up around 11:20. Other travelers emerging from various corners of the terminal, with that particular late-night weariness that transcended class boundaries. A businessman in a rumpled suit claimed the seat across from Marcus and immediately fell asleep with his mouth open. A young couple argued in whispers about something involving their Airbnb reservation. An elderly woman with impeccable posture settled into a chair near the window and pulled out a paperback novel, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Pre-boarding was called at 11:35 for passengers needing extra time, followed by first class and elite status holders, and Marcus found himself standing in line behind a woman in a designer dress that probably cost more than his entire outfit, and a man whose suit had clearly been tailored by someone who understood how fabric should move across shoulders. They both got friendly smiles from the gate agent. Both got welcomes aboard that sounded genuine. Both disappeared down the jet bridge without anyone questioning their right to be there. Marcus handed over his boarding pass and waited for it. That microscopic hesitation. That fractional pause before the scanner beeped its approval. The gate agent's smile was perfect, professional, practiced, though something flickered behind her eyes as she looked from the boarding pass to Marcus's face and back again. "Seat 1A, Mr. Bennett. Enjoy your flight." The jet bridge smelled like recycled air and industrial cleaning solution. LED strips along the floor creating pools of blue-white light that made everyone look vaguely corpse-like. Marcus could hear the aircraft before he saw it. That particular rumble of auxiliary power units and the distant whine of ground equipment, sounds that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat after 20 years of constant travel. The Boeing 787 sat at the end of the bridge like a sleeping giant, its windows dark except for the soft glow from the cabin, its engines silent but ready, waiting for passengers and fuel and permission to launch itself into the storm-torn sky. The entrance to the aircraft was that awkward transition space where the jet bridge met the fuselage, where flight attendants stood with smiles that had been manufactured in training programs designed by corporate psychologists who understood exactly how much warmth could be synthesized without being genuine. A younger woman with dark hair and a name tag reading Sophia greeted him with what looked like actual friendliness, though her eyes held a nervousness that suggested she was newer to this than her colleague standing deeper in the cabin. "Welcome aboard, sir. You're in 1A, just up here on the left." Marcus nodded his thanks and moved into the first-class cabin, that particular sanctuary of leather seats and extra legroom that separated the people willing to pay $6,000 from the people who paid $600 for the same destination at the same arrival time with slightly less space between their knees. The cabin was empty except for him, the seats still in their upright positions, the overhead bins closed, everything waiting in that state of potential energy before passengers arrived to claim their territories. Seat 1A sat by the window, the best seat in first class by most metrics, maximum privacy and minimum foot traffic. Marcus dropped into it with a relief so profound it was almost physical, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that had been building for 48 hours. The seat controls were intuitive, the kind of design that cost thousands of hours of research to make feel effortless, and within seconds he had the seat fully reclined, the reading light off, his noise-canceling earbuds creating a bubble of blessed silence around his skull. Sleep came fast and heavy, the kind that dragged him down into darkness before he could even form conscious thoughts about whether this was a good idea. His last awareness was of the cabin door closing somewhere behind him, of the gentle chime that signaled boarding was complete, of his phone still recording everything through an app he'd activated the moment he'd settled into his seat, creating a permanent record of whatever was about to happen next. He didn't hear the flight attendant approach, didn't hear her heels clicking against the cabin floor with increasing speed, didn't hear the sharp intake of breath when she saw him, or the whispered conversation that started in the galley, or the way another voice joined the first with concern bleeding through professional training. What Marcus heard eventually was a voice cutting through the cocoon of noise cancellation and exhaustion, sharp enough to drag him back toward consciousness, loaded with an authority that had no business existing in a service industry but somehow flourished there anyway. "Sir, you need to wake up right now." The words landed like ice water. Marcus surfaced from sleep with the disorientation of someone pulled from deep water, his earbuds still in but somehow not blocking the voice, his eyes adjusting to cabin lights that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness behind his eyelids. A woman stood over him, her blonde hair pulled back with geometric precision, Her navy uniform pressed to military specifications, her expression broadcasting a combination of suspicion and certainty that he'd seen too many times to mistake for anything other than what it was. The name tag on her chest read C. Morrison, Lotharitum, flight attendant. Marcus pulled one earbud out, his brain still trying to process the transition from sleep to whatever this was, trying to understand why someone was waking him up when the aircraft hadn't even started pushback yet, when boarding should still be ongoing, when literally nothing about this situation made sense except in the context of patterns he'd been watching play out for his entire adult life. I need to see your boarding pass. Not a request, a demand. The kind of thing that might be reasonable if he'd been causing a disturbance or sitting in the wrong seat, or doing literally anything other than sleeping in the exact location his $6,800 ticket entitled him to occupy. Marcus reached for his phone, movements still slow with sleep, trying to keep his voice level despite the anger beginning to build behind his sternum. It's on my phone. Digital boarding pass. Christine Morrison's expression suggested she'd heard that before, probably from people she'd already determined didn't belong in first class. People whose word she'd decided couldn't be trusted without verification and documentation, and whatever other hoops she felt entitled to make them jump through. Her hand was already extended, palm up, waiting for evidence that Marcus belonged here, that he hadn't somehow snuck past gate agents and security checkpoints and every other barrier between economy and this particular leather seat. I'll need to see it. I don't have your name on my first-class manifest. The lie was smooth, practiced, delivered with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting away with exactly this behavior. Marcus knew she hadn't checked the manifest, knew it was impossible for her to have checked it in the 30 seconds since boarding had begun, knew with mathematical certainty that his name was exactly where it should be, in whatever database she'd allegedly consulted. But calling her a liar wouldn't help, wouldn't change anything, would only give her ammunition to claim he was being difficult or aggressive or whatever other code words she'd learned to deploy when confronted with evidence that her initial assessment might be wrong. He pulled up the boarding pass on his phone, the screen brightness making him squint, every detail perfectly clear in the backlit display. Seat 1A, Marcus Bennett, Skylink Airways Flight 2847, confirmation number, barcode, everything exactly as it should be, as it had been when the gate agent scanned it, as it had been when the system charged his credit card 3 hours ago. Christine Morrison looked at the screen for exactly 2 seconds before her expression hardened into something that made Marcus's chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen that look before in hotel lobbies and restaurant hostess stands. The look of someone who'd already decided that rules and evidence didn't matter because their intuition, their gut feeling, their fundamental sense of who belonged where superseded anything as trivial as documentation. This could be faked. I've seen passengers try to scam their way into first class before. The words hung in the air like poison gas, spreading through the cabin, reaching the other passengers who were beginning to board. The businessman settling into 2A with his laptop already open. The elderly woman claiming 2B with her book and reading glasses. Both of them now watching this interaction with the kind of attention that suggested they understood something significant was happening even if they didn't yet know what. Marcus felt something shift inside him. Some decision crystallizing that he hadn't quite made consciously but that felt inevitable now that the moment had arrived. He could prove his identity, could show her his American Express black card with his name embossed on it, could pull up his Skylink Elite status profile showing 11 circumnavigations worth of miles, could do any number of things that would force her to back down, to apologize, to pretend this had all been a reasonable misunderstanding rather than exactly what both of them knew it actually was. Instead, he reached into his hoodie pocket and activated the voice recording app he'd installed specifically for situations like this, the one that had been running since he'd boarded. The one that was now capturing every word of this conversation for purposes that Christine Morrison couldn't possibly imagine. You can verify my reservation through your system, Marcus Bennett. Seat 1A. I booked it 3 hours ago and received immediate confirmation. Christine's jaw tightened, some muscle jumping beneath professionally applied makeup, her entire posture broadcasting that she wasn't used to being questioned, wasn't comfortable with passengers who pushed back against her authority. Behind her, Sophia appeared with champagne flutes on a silver tray, her eyes darting between Marcus and her supervisor with obvious discomfort. But Christine waved her away with a gesture that brooked no argument. I'm going to need you to wait here while I verify this with the gate. She turned on her heel and disappeared toward the front galley, leaving Marcus alone with the other passengers who were now definitely paying attention, their curiosity mixing with something that might have been sympathy or might have been judgment. Impossible to tell in the carefully neutral expressions that people wore when witnessing potential conflict on an aircraft. The businessman in 2A had paused his typing, his fingers hovering over the keyboard like a pianist holding a chord. The elderly woman in 2B had lowered her book far enough that her eyes were visible over the top, concern etched into the lines around them. Marcus settled back into his seat and closed his eyes. Not because he was calm, but because staying still was the only way to keep the anger from showing, the only way to maintain the appearance of someone who wasn't bothered by any of this, who hadn't been through this exact scenario enough times to have it memorized like a script he never auditioned for but kept being cast in anyway. The aircraft filled around him, other passengers claiming their first-class seats with the easy entitlement of people who'd never been questioned about their right to be there, never been asked to prove they could afford what they'd already purchased, never had to justify their presence in spaces that should have been open to anyone with a valid ticket and functioning credit card. A woman in an expensive suit claimed seat 3A without a word from Christine. A couple settled into 3C and 3D with friendly greetings and offers of champagne that appeared without them having to wait or prove or explain anything. When Christine Morrison returned, she had backup. Another flight attendant trailed behind her, younger, more hesitant, her name tag reading Maria, and behind them both came a figure that made Marcus's stomach drop even as part of his brain registered that this was exactly what he'd been waiting for. Exactly the evidence he needed that the problem went deeper than one prejudiced employee. The man wore a captain's uniform with 4 stripes on his shoulders, his silver hair combed back from a face that carried the kind of weathered authority that came from decades in cockpits, his potbelly straining slightly against his shirt as he moved down the aisle with the certainty of someone who'd never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose to enter. Captain Victor Hayes stopped at row 1 and looked down at Marcus with eyes that had already made their assessment, already reached their conclusion, already decided how this was going to play out. His voice carried the weight of institutional power, the kind that had been accumulating for 58 years in a body that had never once been asked to prove it belonged somewhere. Sir, we seem to have an issue with your seating assignment. I'm going to need you to come with me so we can sort this out. Marcus didn't move. His phone was still recording in his pocket, capturing every word, every inflection. Every piece of evidence that would matter later when people tried to claim this had been a misunderstanding or an overreaction, or anything other than exactly what it was. He kept his voice level, kept everything calm and professional, because losing control now would only give them what they wanted. Captain Hayes, my name is Marcus Bennett. I have a valid boarding pass for seat 1A, purchased 3 hours ago through your airline's mobile app. Ms. Morrison can verify this through her system if she hasn't already. Hayes's expression didn't change, didn't show any indication that he'd heard Marcus's words or cared about their content, because men like Victor Hayes didn't need to care about documentation when they had authority, didn't need evidence when they had power, didn't need to check anything when their gut feeling told them someone didn't billing. On my aircraft, I'm the law. You have 30 seconds to gather your belongings and move to economy, or I'll have security remove you by force. The words landed like a hammer on glass, shattering whatever thin pretense of professionalism had been maintaining the fiction that this was about procedures or verification, or anything other than a captain exercising power for its own sake. Around them, the cabin had gone silent, every passenger now openly watching, phones emerging from pockets and purses as people realized they were witnessing something that would be worth recording, worth sharing, worth preserving as evidence of whatever was about to happen next. Marcus felt the moment crystallize around him, felt the weight of every similar interaction stretching back through 23 years to that first time he'd been pulled off an aircraft for the crime of not matching someone's mental image of who belonged in premium seating. He could comply, could gather his bag and move to economy and let this go. Let Christine Morrison and Victor Hayes continue treating people however they wanted because nobody with power had ever stopped them. Could preserve his anonymity for another few hours and address this through proper channels later, through lawyers and corporate restructuring and all the bureaucratic mechanisms available to someone who owned the company these people worked for. But something in Hayes's voice, in that casual invocation of personal authority over institutional rules, in the absolute certainty that his word mattered more than Marcus's documentation, made the decision easy. "I'm not moving. You're making a serious mistake, Captain. I suggest you verify my reservation before this goes any further." Hayes's face flushed red, blood pressure spiking visible beneath his skin, and Marcus watched as the man's hand moved toward the phone clipped to his belt. Watched as Christine Morrison's expression shifted from vindication to something harder and more dangerous. Watched as the moment crossed from confrontation into something that would require intervention from people with badges and authority that superseded even a captain's territorial claims. "Call Port Authority," Hayes said to Christine, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Tell them we have an uncooperative passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions. Tell them he's potentially threatening and needs to be removed immediately." Sophia made a small sound of protest that Christine silenced with a look, and Marcus felt the machinery of institutional power beginning to turn. Felt the weight of systems designed to protect authority rather than question it. Felt 23 years of pattern and precedent and practice all converging on this single moment in Seat 1A of an aircraft that belonged to him, flown by people who worked for him. Operating under rules he could change with a single phone call but wouldn't, because some lessons could only be taught through experience. Some changes only happened when the people who needed to learn got dragged through the consequences of their own actions. He settled deeper into his seat and waited for what came next, his phone still recording in his pocket, his expression calm despite the rage burning behind his sternum. His body relaxed even as every instinct screamed at him to run or fight or do anything except sit here and let this play out to whatever conclusion the universe had planned. The elderly woman in 2B leaned forward, her voice carrying clearly in the silent cabin, age and accumulated dignity making her fearless in ways that privilege protected. "Excuse me, Captain, but I've been sitting here the whole time. This gentleman hasn't done anything wrong. He's just been sleeping peacefully." Hayes didn't even look at her, didn't acknowledge her existence, because people like Victor Hayes had spent their entire careers learning which voices mattered and which could be safely ignored, which witnesses carried weight and which could be dismissed as irrelevant to whatever narrative best served their interests. Christine was already on the phone, already describing a situation that bore no resemblance to reality. Already transforming a sleeping passenger into a security threat through nothing more than tone and implication, and the assumption that whoever answered would believe her version of events over any evidence to the contrary. And Marcus sat in Seat 1A and waited for the consequences to arrive, because sometimes the only way to fix a broken system was to let it break so completely that everyone could see the cracks, so thoroughly that nobody could pretend everything was fine, so publicly that the people responsible couldn't hide behind policies and procedures and institutional inertia. The recording app in his pocket showed 37 minutes of continuous audio, every word preserved in perfect digital clarity, and somewhere far above, weather radar showed the storm over Chicago beginning to clear, revealing the lights of a city that had no idea what was about to land. Port Authority officers Ryan Cooper and Lisa Turner arrived at Gate 12 with the kind of weary professionalism that came from handling their third passenger dispute of the night. Their utility belts heavy with equipment that rarely got used but always needed to be present. Radios crackling with traffic from other corners of JFK that never truly slept. Cooper was 35 and built like someone who'd played college football before discovering that sitting in a patrol car destroyed whatever conditioning youth had provided, while Turner was 31 and still carried herself with the alertness of someone who hadn't yet learned that most airport security calls resolved themselves through conversation rather than confrontation. They moved down the jet bridge with footsteps that echoed against composite walls, the sound announcing their arrival before they reached the aircraft entrance where Sophia stood wringing her hands like someone who'd just realized she was complicit in something that might define the rest of her career. Her eyes darted between the officers and the cabin beyond, trapped between wanting to warn them that this felt wrong and not having enough seniority or confidence to actually say the words out loud. Christine Morrison materialized from the forward galley with the expression of someone who'd been proven right. Vindication written across features that had been arranged into professional concern but couldn't quite hide the satisfaction underneath. She pointed towards seat 1A with a manicured finger that trembled slightly, though whether from adrenaline or righteous anger was impossible to determine from where Cooper stood trying to assess the situation through the doorway. Officers, thank you for responding so quickly. The passenger in 1A has refused multiple requests to verify his ticket, become verbally aggressive with crew members, and is now refusing Captain Hayes' direct order to deplane voluntarily. Turner pulled out a notepad from her breast pocket, pen already moving across paper in the practiced shorthand of someone documenting everything because documentation mattered more than memory when supervisors started asking questions later. Cooper moved past Christine into the cabin proper, his eyes scanning the scene with training that told him to assess threats before engaging, to understand the geometry of the space and identify exits and evaluate whether anyone present posed immediate danger. What he saw was a black man in casual clothes sitting calmly in a first-class seat, his posture relaxed despite the tension radiating from the flight attendant and captain flanking him, his hands visible and empty, his expression carrying the kind of controlled neutrality that Cooper had learned to recognize from too many similar situations. No aggressive stance, no threatening gestures, nothing that matched the description Christine Morrison had provided over the phone about an uncooperative passenger creating a disturbance. The other first-class passengers watched from their seats with phones already recording, creating multiple angles of documentation that would preserve this moment in digital amber regardless of how it resolved. A businessman in 2A held his device steady with both hands, the screen showing a live stream counter that had already climbed past 3,000 viewers. The elderly woman in 2B had abandoned any pretense of reading, her book closed on her lap and her eyes fixed on Cooper with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail for later testimony. Captain Hayes stepped forward before Cooper could ask any questions, his uniform and rank creating an automatic authority that most people never thought to question. His voice carrying that particular timbre of command that pilots cultivated over decades of telling passengers and crew what to do and expecting immediate compliance. Officers, this individual is trespassing in first class. We need him removed from the aircraft immediately so we can complete boarding and maintain our schedule. Cooper's eyes moved from Hayes to Marcus, cataloging details that didn't quite fit the narrative being constructed around him. The messenger bag looked expensive, worn but well-made leather that cost more than the knockoffs sold at street vendors. The hoodie was soft cashmere rather than cheap cotton, the kind of garment that whispered money to anyone who knew how to read the signals. The sneakers were limited edition Jordans that resold for 4 figures on secondary markets, though their scuffed condition suggested someone who wore them for comfort rather than status. "Sir, can you verify your ticket for this flight?" Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket with movements that were deliberately slow and unthreatening, The kind of careful choreography that people learned when they understood how quickly situations could escalate based on nothing more than perceived sudden movements. The screen illuminated his face from below as he navigated to the boarding pass, casting shadows that made him look older and more tired than 42 years should warrant. Marcus Bennett, Seat 1A, purchased 3 hours ago through the Skylink mobile app. Confirmation number is right here, along with the barcode your gate agent scanned when I boarded. Cooper took the phone and examined the screen with attention that was probably unnecessary given how sophisticated airline booking systems had become. But thoroughness was what separated officers who lasted from officers who ended up in internal affairs investigations. Everything looked legitimate. The name matched. The seat assignment was clear. The confirmation number formatted correctly for Skylink's systems. Even the timestamp showed recent purchase, which aligned with Marcus's claim about booking the flight just hours before departure. Ms. Morrison, did you verify this reservation in your system? Christine's expression flickered, some micro-expression crossing her features too quickly to interpret fully but suggesting discomfort with the question. With having her actions scrutinized instead of simply accepted as correct, because she wore the uniform and carried the title of lead flight attendant. I checked the first-class manifest when I came on duty. His name wasn't there. When did you come on duty? The question came from Turner, who'd been watching the interaction with the kind of attention that newer officers brought to situations before experience taught them which details actually mattered. Christine's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to tell Cooper that whatever she'd checked had been cursory at best, that her certainty about Marcus not belonging had preceded any actual verification. About 40 minutes ago, but I've been doing this for 16 years, officer. I can tell when something isn't right. Marcus's laugh was short and bitter, the sound of someone who'd heard variations of this justification too many times to count, who understood that something isn't right was code for prejudices that couldn't be spoken aloud, but got acted upon anyway, dressed up in the language of professional intuition and security concerns. What you can tell, Ms. Morrison, is that I don't match your mental image of who belongs in first class, but matching your expectations isn't a requirement for air travel. Christine's face flushed, anger breaking through professional composure, and Cooper saw the moment shift from a potential misunderstanding into something that would require actual intervention. Hayes moved closer, his bulk intended to intimidate, his voice dropping into registers that probably worked on junior crew members but carried less weight with law enforcement. Officer Cooper, are you going to handle this situation or do I need to call your supervisor? This passenger has been given multiple opportunities to comply with crew instructions. His continued presence is delaying my flight and creating a hostile environment for other passengers. Turner's pen stopped moving across her notepad, and Cooper felt the weight of institutional expectations settling onto his shoulders like a physical thing. The captain wanted action. The flight attendant wanted vindication. The other passengers wanted resolution so they could get to Chicago before sunrise. Everyone had their priorities, their pressures, their reasons for wanting this to end quickly and cleanly, regardless of whether quick and clean meant right. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us while we verify your ticket with the gate. Marcus stayed seated, his body language still relaxed despite the escalation, despite the two armed officers now flanking him and the captain looming nearby, like a weather system about to break. His voice remained level, professional, carrying none of the anger that Cooper could see building behind his eyes. Officer, you have my confirmation number. You can verify it through your radio right now by calling the gate. You can check my ID against my boarding pass. You can do literally anything except what you're suggesting, which is removing a paying passenger who hasn't violated any policy or law. Cooper's training said comply with crew requests. His experience said something here didn't add up. The passenger was calm, articulate, had documentation, hadn't made threats or caused disturbances. But the captain was insistent, the lead flight attendant was adamant, and Cooper had learned over a decade in law enforcement that questioning authority figures in front of civilians created political problems that followed you through your career like shadows. "Sir, this is your last warning. Stand up and come with us voluntarily or we'll be forced to remove you." The businessman in 2A leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension with the confidence of someone who'd never been ignored when he spoke, whose opinion carried weight simply because he existed in spaces where opinions mattered. "Excuse me, officers, but I've been watching this entire interaction since I boarded. This gentleman hasn't done anything threatening or disruptive." He was sleeping when Miss Morrison woke him up and started questioning his right to be here. Hayes wheeled on the businessman with fury that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being contradicted by anyone, much less passengers who should have known their place in the hierarchy of aircraft authority. "Sir, if you continue to interfere with flight operations, you'll be removed as well. Return to your seat immediately." The businessman's eyes widened, the shock of someone discovering that rules applied to him too, that speaking up carried consequences even when you were right. Even when you had documentation and witnesses and every reason to believe justice would prevail. He sank back into his seat but kept his phone recording, the counter on his screen now showing 15,000 viewers and climbing as the video propagated through social media networks, where controversy traveled faster than aircraft. Cooper made his decision with the kind of resignation that came from years of choosing institutional loyalty over individual judgment. Knowing it was probably wrong, but not seeing a path forward that didn't end with reprimands and questions about why he'd sided with an uncooperative passenger over an airline captain and senior crew member. "Stand up, sir. Hands behind your back." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, some calculation being made about costs and benefits and whether the point he was trying to prove was worth whatever came next. He stood slowly, his height becoming apparent as he rose to his full 6 feet 3 inches, broad shoulders filling out the hoodie in ways that probably made him look more threatening to people who'd already decided he was a threat. "I want it noted that I'm complying under protest. I have a valid ticket, I've violated no policies, and this is discriminatory treatment based on my appearance." Cooper pulled handcuffs from his belt, the metal cold against his palm, and reached for Marcus's wrist with hands that had done this hundreds of times before on people who actually deserved it, on criminals and drunks and travelers who'd crossed lines that Marcus Bennett hadn't approached. The cuffs clicked closed with that distinctive sound that always made Cooper's stomach tighten slightly. That permanent record of having escalated from conversation to restraint. "The cuffs are too tight." Cooper had heard that before, usually from people trying to claim excessive force after the fact, trying to build cases about brutality when really they'd just been uncomfortable with the reality of metal restraints cutting into skin. But something about Marcus's tone suggested this wasn't manipulation or exaggeration. It was simply a statement of fact delivered with the expectation that facts mattered, that documenting discomfort might become relevant later. Turner moved to Marcus's other side, her hand on his elbow. Guidance that was meant to be professional, but came across as controlling, as assertion of power over someone who'd already surrendered autonomy by allowing the cuffs. Cooper gripped Marcus's other arm and they began moving him toward the aisle, 3 bodies navigating the narrow space between first-class seats while passengers recorded from every angle and Christine Morrison watched with satisfaction bleeding through her professional mask. Marcus's shoulder clipped the edge of the overhead bin as they maneuvered him around the seat, a glancing contact that wouldn't have mattered except Cooper felt him flinch, felt the impact register through tensed muscles. Then they were in the aisle proper, more room to maneuver, and Cooper was thinking this would be over soon, thinking they'd get him to the terminal and sort everything out and probably end up apologizing once the gate confirmed his ticket, when Turner pulled too hard on Marcus's arm and his balance shifted wrong. The sequence happened faster than Cooper's training could process. Marcus stumbling forward, Turner overcorrecting, Cooper trying to stabilize but having the wrong angle. Marcus's temple connecting with the edge of the overhead bin with a sound that made everyone in the cabin gasp. That distinctive crack of skull meeting hard surface that preceded bad outcomes and incident reports and union representatives asking uncomfortable questions. Blood appeared instantly, dark against Marcus's skin, running down from the gash above his eyebrow in rivulets that followed the contours of his face with gravity's inevitability. Marcus made a sound low in his throat, pain breaking through whatever control he'd been maintaining, and his knees buckled enough that Cooper had to grab harder to keep him upright, had to use force that would look even worse when people reviewed the footage later. "I need medical attention." The words came out tight, strained through clenched teeth, and Cooper felt something in his chest constrict because this had gone from questionable to indefensible in the span of 3 seconds. Because head injuries bled dramatically and looked terrible on camera and turned routine removals into excessive force complaints that ended careers. "Keep moving." Turner's voice carried an edge of panic now, the realization that they'd crossed some line setting in, that this would require explanations and paperwork and possibly lawyers depending on how badly Marcus was actually hurt. They pulled him down the aisle while blood dripped onto the carpet, while the businessman's live stream counter hit 50,000 viewers, while the elderly woman in 2B stood up with her phone out demanding they stop and get medical help, while Sophia pressed herself against the galley wall with tears streaming down her face because she'd known this was wrong from the beginning, but hadn't had the courage to say so when it might have mattered. Marcus's knee hit the armrest of seat 2A as they dragged him past, another impact that made him grunt, that would leave bruises even if nothing was broken. That added to the documentation of excessive force being created by a dozen different camera angles. The metallic taste of blood filled Marcus's mouth, where he'd bitten his lip during the initial impact, copper mixing with the rage he could feel building in his chest alongside the pain radiating from his temple. The jet bridge felt endless, Cooper and Turner half carrying Marcus between them because his balance was compromised by the head injury and the handcuffs and the exhaustion that had been building for 48 hours before any of this started. Other passengers pressed against the walls to let them pass, their faces showing everything from concern to confusion to that particular brand of performative ignorance that let people witness injustice without feeling obligated to intervene. They reached the terminal and Cooper steered them toward a security office that existed precisely for situations like this. A windowless room with chairs bolted to the floor and cameras recording everything, and the institutional smell of fear and fluorescent lighting that permeated every law enforcement space regardless of jurisdiction. Turner radioed for medical as they manhandled Marcus into one of the chairs, and Cooper finally removed the handcuffs because keeping them on someone actively bleeding from a head wound felt like the kind of detail that would look especially bad in whatever investigation was coming. Marcus sat with his head tilted back, trying to slow the bleeding through pressure and elevation. His hoodie now stained dark where blood had run down his neck. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was controlled, deliberate. The pattern of someone managing pain through focus rather than medication. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the anger Cooper had been expecting, only a weariness that suggested this was familiar territory rather than shocking development. "I need to make a phone call." Cooper glanced at Turner, who was still cataloging the scene with her notepad like documentation would somehow protect them from what they'd done. Like writing down accurate descriptions of excessive force made it less excessive. The regulations were clear about phone calls, about rights and procedures and all the bureaucratic machinery that protected citizens from arbitrary detention, though Cooper wondered how many of those protections actually applied to someone removed from an aircraft at crew request. "You can call a lawyer once we've processed you." Marcus's laugh was short and sharp, the sound of someone who understood more about the situation than the people who thought they were in control. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Cooper with an intensity that made the officer take an involuntary step backward, some survival instinct recognizing predator even when the predator was handcuffed and bleeding and theoretically powerless. I don't need a lawyer, Officer Cooper. I need to make one phone call, and then you need to step back and watch what happens next. Turner's radio crackled with an incoming call, the dispatcher's voice tight with urgency that suggested something bigger than a routine passenger removal was developing. Cooper reached for the radio, but Turner had already answered, her expression shifting from concern to confusion as she listened to whatever was being relayed from airport operations. Say again? All Skylink aircraft at JFK? The response was too quiet for Cooper to hear clearly, but he watched Turner's face go pale, watched her eyes dart to Marcus and then away like she couldn't bear to look directly at whatever realization was forming. She lowered the radio with hands that trembled slightly, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. Operations is calling a ground stop for every Skylink aircraft at JFK FAA priority override. No explanation provided except it's a VIP emergency and we're to stand by for further instructions. Cooper felt his stomach drop, that particular sensation of recognizing disaster before understanding its full scope, before knowing exactly how bad things were about to get, but certain they were about to get very bad indeed. Marcus was watching them both now, his expression unreadable despite the blood still seeping through the makeshift pressure bandage he'd created from paper towels, his posture suggesting someone waiting for a punchline everyone else had missed. My phone call, Officer Cooper. Now would be an excellent time. Turner handed over her phone with the mechanical movements of someone in shock. Someone whose brain was trying to process information that didn't fit existing frameworks, that suggested their understanding of the situation had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. Marcus took it carefully, mindful of the blood on his fingers, and dialed a number from memory with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. The conversation was brief, conducted in tones too low for Cooper to hear clearly, but he caught fragments that made his chest constrict with growing dread. Ground them all, now! Authorization Sierra 7 Alpha. A pause while someone on the other end responded. I don't care how many aircraft, this is non-negotiable. Marcus ended the call and handed the phone back to Turner, his expression still neutral despite what he'd just done. Whatever authority he'd just exercised that had apparently resulted in 43 commercial aircraft being simultaneously grounded at one of the busiest airports in the world. Cooper's radio erupted with traffic as the ground stop rippled through airport operations, as gate agents and ground crew and supervisors all demanded explanations for why hundreds of passengers were suddenly trapped in a holding pattern that nobody understood. The door to the security office burst open and a woman in a Skylink Airways corporate uniform rushed in. Her tablet clutched against her chest and panic written across every line of her face. She was mid-40s, professionally dressed in a way that suggested executive rather than line staff, her name tag identifying her as Rebecca Stone, though her title wasn't visible beneath the jacket she wore. Where is he? Where's Marcus Bennett? Cooper pointed mutely at Marcus, who was still applying pressure to his head wound with blood-soaked paper towels, who looked like someone who'd been assaulted rather than someone capable of shutting down airline operations across an entire airport. Rebecca stopped dead when she saw him, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to catalog, horror and recognition and something that looked like desperation, all fighting for dominance. Mr. Bennett, oh my God, what did they do to you? The words carried weight that Cooper didn't understand, implications of relationships and hierarchies that hadn't been visible during the removal, that suggested Marcus Bennett was more than just another passenger with a boarding pass and a complaint. Rebecca knelt beside his chair with a familiarity that spoke of prior meetings, prior interactions, a professional relationship that predated this incident by months or years. Head injury from improper handling during removal, possible concussion, handcuffs applied despite full compliance. Marcus recited the facts clinically, documenting his own assault with the detachment of someone who understood that emotion would undermine credibility, that judges and juries and corporate boards responded to evidence rather than anger. Rebecca's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone, her fingers moving across the screen with frantic energy that suggested she was trying to contain a situation already spiraling beyond anyone's control. Cooper watched her type something, hit send, then immediately start typing again. Messages flowing outward to people whose names he couldn't see but whose importance became apparent from how quickly responses flooded back. The jet bridge has been reattached to aircraft 447. Captain Hayes and Ms. Morrison are being detained by airport security pending investigation. Legal is on their way. Medical should be here within 2 minutes. Rebecca looked up from her phone, her eyes meeting Cooper's with an expression that made him want to be anywhere else in the world. Officer Cooper, Officer Turner, you need to understand something very important about what just happened. Turner's notepad had fallen from nerveless fingers. Pages scattered across the floor like evidence of normalcy abandoned, and Cooper felt his career compressing into this single moment, into whatever revelation Rebecca Stone was about to deliver that would explain the ground stop and the panic, and the way Marcus Bennett sat bleeding but somehow still in control of everything happening around him. That man you just arrested and injured is Marcus Bennett. As of 6 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time this morning, he owns Skylink Airways. All of it. Every aircraft, every gate, every employee. The acquisition closed while he was in flight from London, and the executive notifications went out 40 minutes ago to senior leadership. The words landed like physical blows, each one compounding the previous damage, building toward a total that Cooper's brain couldn't quite process because it was too large. Too absurd, too perfectly terrible to be real. He'd arrested the owner of an airline for trespassing on his own aircraft. He'd injured a billionaire CEO while removing him from a seat he'd paid for on a carrier he'd just purchased. He'd created exactly the kind of incident that ended careers and triggered lawsuits and became case studies in what not to do when exercising law enforcement authority. Turner made a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. All the professional confidence draining out in a single exhalation, and Cooper felt his knees weaken enough that he had to lean against the wall for support. Marcus was watching them both with eyes that held no satisfaction, no triumph, only a kind of weary recognition that this was how these situations always resolved, that power eventually asserted itself but only after forcing those without it to endure indignities that should never have been necessary. The FAA ground stop was Mr. Bennett's order, executed through his authority as majority owner and acting CEO. All 43 Skylink aircraft at JFK are currently holding at gates or taxiways, pending his instruction on whether operations should resume. Rebecca's voice carried the flat effect of someone delivering news that would destroy careers, that would reshape entire organizational structures, that would ripple through the airline industry like seismic waves from an unexpected earthquake. Cooper's radio exploded with urgent traffic requesting his presence at the Skylink gate, demanding explanations for why a passenger removal had triggered a system-wide ground stop. Asking questions he had no ability to answer because his understanding of the situation had been fundamentally wrong from the moment he'd stepped onto that aircraft. Airport police supervisors were calling for him by name now, using tones that suggested disciplinary action was already being contemplated, that the investigation had effectively begun before anyone understood what they were investigating. "I need medical attention for this head wound, Officer Cooper. And then I need to return to aircraft 447 because Captain Hayes and Ms. Morrison are about to receive a very important lesson about consequences." Marcus stood with care, testing his balance before committing his full weight, and Cooper saw him properly for the first time since this had started. Saw past the hoodie and casual clothes to the bearing underneath. The confidence that came from wielding power even when stripped of its visible trappings. This was someone who'd built billion-dollar companies, who'd negotiated acquisitions measured in hundreds of millions, who'd spent decades learning to move through spaces that didn't want him and claiming them anyway, through persistence and capital and the kind of patient rage that waited years for the right moment to strike. The paramedics arrived with their equipment bags and concerned expressions, their assessment of the head wound accompanied by pointed questions about how Marcus had sustained it. Questions that Cooper couldn't answer honestly without incriminating himself, that Turner avoided by suddenly becoming very interested in her scattered notepad pages. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound would require stitches, the paramedic said, possibly imaging to rule out fracture, definitely documentation of the injury for medical records that would become legal evidence when lawyers started circling. "I'll get treatment after I address my employees. This takes priority." Marcus's voice carried the kind of authority that made paramedics step back, even though their training said head injuries required immediate attention. Even though protocol demanded they advocate for patient care over patient preference. Rebecca was already moving toward the door, her phone still pressed against her ear, coordinating logistics that Cooper could only partially hear but which seemed to involve SUVs and corporate attorneys and EAA inspectors being summoned from wherever they spent Tuesday nights at midnight. Marcus followed with Cooper and Turner trailing behind like criminals being escorted to sentencing, the complete inversion of power dynamics from 15 minutes ago so total that it felt almost dreamlike. The terminal had transformed in the time they'd been in the security office. News helicopters visible through the windows circling JFK with their cameras trained downward. Ground crews standing idle beside aircraft that couldn't move. Passengers pressing against windows trying to understand why their flights had been indefinitely delayed. Gate agents clustered around monitors showing system-wide alerts, their conversations mixing confusion with growing awareness that whatever had happened was unprecedented in scope, that normal operations had been suspended by authority none of them understood. The walk back to Gate 12 felt eternal. Marcus's blood-stained hoodie drawing stares from travelers and employees alike. Rebecca's corporate uniform creating a bubble of authority that parted crowds. Cooper and Turner's presence as law enforcement officers now seeming almost decorative, given how thoroughly they'd lost control of the situation. The jet bridge loomed ahead like a tunnel into consequences that kept multiplying, kept revealing new layers of disaster with each step closer. Aircraft 447 sat at the gate with its door still open. Cabin lights bright against the darkness outside. Passengers visible through windows looking confused and restless as boarding remained suspended without explanation. Captain Hayes stood in the terminal with 2 airport security officers flanking him, his uniform no longer conferring automatic authority. His expression cycling between outrage and growing uncertainty as he demanded to know why he'd been removed from his own flight deck. Christine Morrison sat in a gate area chair with her hands folded in her lap and her face blank. Shock having apparently overtaken whatever vindication she'd felt during Marcus's removal, though whether she understood yet what she'd actually done remained unclear from her 1,000-yard stare. Sophia stood nearby with tears still streaming down her face, her junior status having protected her from being detained but not from the guilt of having participated even passively in something that had spiraled so far beyond normal passenger service disputes. Marcus stopped walking about 10 feet from where Hayes and Morrison sat, and Cooper watched as 36 people became aware of his presence simultaneously, watched as recognition rippled through the crowd in waves, watched as phones emerged and camera flashes started popping like paparazzi had descended on JFK's gates. The businessman from 2A was already there, his live stream counter showing numbers that had climbed past 200,000 viewers, his narration explaining to his audience that something massive was developing, though he didn't yet understand what. Rebecca stepped forward first, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with corporate authority that suggested this was a woman accustomed to managing crises, though probably none quite like this. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your travel plans this evening. I'm Rebecca Stone, Chief Operating Officer of Skylink Airways. We've experienced an incident that requires immediate resolution before boarding can continue." Hayes tried to stand, tried to reassert his presence as captain, but the security officers flanking him placed hands on his shoulders in a gesture that was polite but firm. that communicated his authority had been suspended pending investigation of whatever had triggered a ground stop affecting 43 aircraft. Christine Morrison remained seated, her eyes finally focusing on Marcus with growing horror as the blood on his hoodie registered as the implications of his presence here began penetrating the shock that had insulated her from reality. Marcus moved forward until he stood directly in front of Hayes, the height difference between them negligible but the power differential now unmistakable. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly enough that everyone at Gate 12 could hear. Clearly enough that the businessman's live stream captured every syllable, clearly enough that the recording would be replayed millions of times in the hours and days to come. Captain Hayes, you told me that on your aircraft you're the law. But this isn't your aircraft. As of 6 o'clock this morning, Greenwich Mean Time, I own Skylink Airways. Every plane, every gate, every employee. Which means this isn't your aircraft, it's mine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ambient noise of the terminal and the distant sound of news helicopters still circling outside. Hayes's face went through a series of transformations, denial giving way to confusion, giving way to horror as he processed what Marcus had just said, as the impossibility of the situation resolved into terrible certainty. You're fired, Captain Hayes, effective immediately. 16 years of discriminatory behavior toward passengers ends tonight. Marcus turned to Christine Morrison, who'd started shaking in her chair, who'd begun to understand that the consequences of her actions were going to be measured in professional destruction rather than simple reprimands. Ms. Morrison, you told your colleague that people like me belong in economy class, that people like me don't deserve the same service as passengers you deem more appropriate. You have 42 minutes of recorded audio evidence of discriminatory treatment, false accusations, and abuse of authority. You're also fired, effective immediately. Christine made a sound like a wounded animal, some combination of sob and gasp, and tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. Sophia moved to help, but Marcus held up a hand, stopping her with a gesture that was somehow both gentle and absolute. Officer Cooper, Officer Turner, you assaulted a passenger who was fully compliant, causing visible injury that required medical attention. You failed to verify the allegations against me before using force. You prioritized institutional authority over individual rights. Marcus touched the wound on his temple, blood still seeping through the bandages. Your badge numbers are being forwarded to your supervisors along with footage from multiple cameras and a formal complaint about excessive force. Cooper felt his career evaporating in real time, felt every decision he'd made in the past hour compressing into a single point of failure that would define how people remembered him, that would follow him through whatever came next, whether that was disciplinary action or criminal charges or simply the quiet understanding that he'd destroyed his own future through a combination of bad judgment and institutional cowardice. Rebecca had her tablet out now, displaying documents that must have been prepared during the ground stop, legal paperwork that transformed verbal pronouncements into official corporate action. She approached Hayes first, the tablet extended with termination papers already loaded and requiring only acknowledgement to complete the process. Captain Victor Hayes, your employment with Skylink Airways is terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct, abuse of authority, and failure to follow verification procedures required by company policy. Your final paycheck will be processed according to contractual obligations, but your flight privileges are permanently revoked. Hayes tried to speak, tried to mount some defense or explanation, but the security officers were already guiding him away from the gate area toward whatever administrative processing awaited terminated employees, toward an exit that would take him out of the terminal and out of the career he'd spent 30 years building. Christine Morrison received identical treatment, identical paperwork, identical escort away from the gate where she'd exercised authority that had seemed absolute right up until it evaporated. The passengers who'd remained at Gate 12 began applauding, spontaneous recognition that justice had somehow been served even if the mechanism remained unclear to most of them. The businessman's live stream chat was exploding with reactions, comments flowing past faster than anyone could read, the video being shared and reshared across social media platforms where controversy traveled at light speed and context lagged behind by hours. Marcus turned back to the aircraft, blood still visible on his hoodie, exhaustion evident in every line of his body, but something else present too. Some sense of purpose that went beyond personal vindication. Sophia stood at the jet bridge entrance looking terrified, looking like someone waiting for judgment. Looking like she expected to be fired alongside her colleagues despite having tried to intervene. "Ms. Ramirez, you're not being terminated. You attempted to prevent this situation, which showed better judgment than either of your supervisors. Consider yourself promoted to lead flight attendant on this aircraft for the remainder of the flight. We'll discuss your long-term role in training and oversight tomorrow." Sophia's expression transformed from terror to shock to something approaching hope. Though tears continued streaming down her face as she tried to process being promoted in the same conversation that had destroyed two of her colleagues. Marcus moved past her into the jet bridge, Rebecca following close behind with her tablet and phone, and the weight of corporate crisis management settling onto shoulders that looked barely capable of supporting it. The walk back onto aircraft 447 felt like entering a different world despite being the same physical space Marcus had occupied 45 minutes earlier. The geometry unchanged, but the context transformed so completely that even familiar seats seemed foreign. The first-class passengers who'd witnessed his removal were still aboard, their phones still recording, their expressions mixing vindication with uncertainty about what happened next. Marcus stopped at the front of the cabin, his tall frame filling the space, his blood-stained hoodie creating a visual reminder that this wasn't some abstract corporate drama, but had involved actual violence, actual injury, actual consequences that went beyond firings and ground stops. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the aircraft, transmitted through dozens of recording devices to audiences that would eventually number in the millions. "My name is Marcus Bennett. I own this airline as of this morning, though obviously our systems haven't updated to reflect that change yet. What happened tonight should never happen to anyone, regardless of who they are or who they know or how much money they have. The fact that it took owning the company to get justice shows exactly how broken our systems are. How many people have been treated this way without recourse, without protection, without anyone powerful enough to force accountability." The elderly woman from 2B stood up slowly, her book forgotten, her face showing the kind of satisfaction that came from witnessing moral clarity expressed through action rather than rhetoric. "Young man, I've been flying for 60 years and I've never seen anything like what just happened. Thank you for not letting them get away with it." Marcus nodded acknowledgement but didn't smile, because this wasn't a victory worth celebrating. Wasn't something that should require ownership and wealth and systemic power to resolve. It was a symptom of disease that ran deeper than individual prejudice, that required surgery rather than bandages that would take years to truly fix even with unlimited resources and absolute authority. Rebecca stood beside him with her tablet, already pulling up documentation of previous incidents, already beginning the investigation that would reveal patterns stretching back years. Already understanding that tonight was just the beginning of a corporate transformation that would reshape Skylink Airways from foundation to summit. "Boarding will resume in 10 minutes once we've assigned a new captain and completed required safety checks. I apologize for the delay and thank you for your patience during this unprecedented situation." Marcus moved back towards seat 1A, his seat, the place where this had all started, and lowered himself into the leather with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The businessman in 2A leaned forward, his live stream finally paused, his expression showing recognition of having witnessed something that transcended typical viral content. "Mr. Bennett, for what it's worth, I recorded everything from the moment Ms. Morrison first approached you. It's already been viewed by over 300,000 people and it's still climbing. What they did to you was unconscionable." Marcus accepted a bottle of water from Sophia, who was still crying but managing to function through the tears, who was learning in real time what it meant to work for someone who valued principle over convenience. He pressed the cold bottle against his temple where the wound still throbbed, where the blood had finally stopped seeping but the pain remained sharp and immediate. Thank you for documenting it. Documentation is how we prove patterns, how we demonstrate that these aren't isolated incidents but systematic failures. Your video will matter when we start the real investigation. Outside the aircraft, Marcus could see airport operations beginning to normalize, could see ground crews returning to their stations as the hold was gradually lifted, could see the machinery of commercial aviation grinding back into motion now that whatever crisis had triggered the ground stop had been addressed. But inside aircraft 447, inside seat 1A where this had all begun, Marcus sat in blood-stained clothes and felt the weight of what came next, settling onto shoulders that had carried billion-dollar acquisitions. But never quite this particular burden of responsibility for making broken systems function the way they should have all along. Aircraft 447 lifted off from JFK at 1:47 a.m., 3 hours behind schedule and carrying passengers who would spend the rest of their lives telling people about the night they'd witnessed a billionaire CEO get arrested on his own airplane. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool window glass and watched New York's lights fall away beneath them. The grid of streets and buildings compressing into abstraction, into patterns that looked almost orderly from this height despite the chaos that defined them at ground level. The wound on his temple throbbed in rhythm with his pulse, the paramedics' butterfly bandages pulling at skin that wanted to split open again, reminding him with each heartbeat that power came with costs that couldn't be delegated or avoided. Sophia moved through the cabin with champagne service that nobody had requested but everyone seemed to need, the ritual of normalcy helping passengers process what they'd witnessed, helping her process what she'd become part of. She paused at Marcus's seat with a glass extended, her hands steady now despite the tears that had finally stopped, her voice carrying determination that hadn't been present during boarding. "Mr. Bennett, I should have done more. Should have refused when Ms. Morrison ordered me to call the captain. Should have stood up for you when it mattered instead of after everything fell apart." Marcus took the champagne but didn't drink, just held the glass and watched bubbles rise through golden liquid like tiny, desperate attempts at escape. The taste would remind him of corporate celebrations and acquisition closings and all the moments when success was supposed to feel triumphant, but mostly just felt exhausting. You tried to intervene with a supervisor who had 16 years of institutional authority behind her prejudices. That took more courage than most people ever manage, Ms. Ramirez. The question now is whether you'll use your new position to make sure this never happens again, or whether you'll become comfortable with authority and forget what it felt like to be powerless. The words settled between them like a challenge and a warning, and Sophia nodded once before moving to continue her service, understanding that promotion wasn't reward, but responsibility, that Marcus had handed her power specifically to test whether she'd wield it differently than the people she'd replaced. The businessman in 2A accepted his champagne with a smile that suggested he was already composing the LinkedIn post about tonight's events, already calculating how many speaking engagements he could book by positioning himself as the witness who'd stood up to injustice, conveniently forgetting that he'd sat back down the moment Captain Hayes had threatened him. The seatbelt sign dimmed and passengers began moving through the cabin with that restless energy that always followed delays, stretching legs and retrieving laptops and settling into whatever routines would carry them through the next 2 hours. Marcus pulled out his phone and disabled airplane mode long enough to send 3 messages that would set machinery in motion before he landed in Chicago, before the sun rose on a day that would reshape Skylink Airways from foundation to rafters. The first went to his chief legal officer with a subject line that read, "Immediate investigation required," and a body containing badge numbers, names, timestamps, and instructions to secure every second of security footage from JFK Terminal 5 dating back 5 years. Pattern analysis would begin at dawn, Algorithm-assisted review of complaint databases cross-referenced with employee records, looking for threads that connected tonight's incident to the 47 previous cases his app had already flagged. Looking for the systematic failures that allowed individual prejudice to metastasize into corporate culture. The second message went to Rebecca Stone with a document attached. 18 pages of policy changes that Marcus had drafted on his laptop during the ground stop while paramedics bandaged his head, while Cooper and Turner contemplated their ruined careers, while Hayes and Morrison learned that authority was conditional and could evaporate faster than morning fog under scrutiny. Mandatory bias training every 6 months. Anonymous complaint system with external review board. Random audit of security footage. Zero tolerance enforcement with termination as default consequence. Implementation timeline measured in weeks rather than months because delay meant more victims, more incidents, more people treated like Marcus had been treated tonight. The third message went to his head of PR with instructions to say nothing, do nothing, release no statements and make no comments regardless of media pressure. Because silence created vacuum and vacuum drew out truth from people desperate to fill it with their own narratives. By morning, the videos would be everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of views becoming millions, becoming tens of millions as algorithms propagated content that generated engagement through outrage. Let the court of public opinion render its verdict first. Let the evidence speak without corporate spin diluting its impact. Let people see exactly what had happened before lawyers and PR professionals started crafting alternative interpretations. Chicago's lights appeared on the horizon like a circuit board viewed from above, the grid of streets illuminated in sodium yellow and LED white. Lake Michigan's darkness providing contrast that made the city seem to float on nothing. Marcus had flown this approach 100 times. Had watched this exact view from windows of aircraft he didn't own, back when being a passenger meant accepting whatever treatment the system provided and hoping it would be adequate. Now he owned the system, which meant the inadequacy became his responsibility, the failures became his to fix. The victims became people he'd failed personally, even if their incidents predated his acquisition. The wheels touched down at O'Hare with a chirp of rubber on concrete. Thrust reversers engaging with their distinctive roar, the deceleration pressing Marcus back into his seat with force that made his head wound throb fresh protest. He kept his eyes closed through taxi and gate approach, conserving energy for what came next, for the investigation that would consume the next week of his life, for the transformation that would require dismantling structures that had existed longer than he'd been alive. The aircraft reached its gate and the seatbelt sign dimmed and passengers erupted into that familiar chaos of grabbing bags and checking phones and pretending they hadn't just witnessed something that would be discussed in business ethics courses for the next decade. Marcus waited until the cabin cleared before standing, his body protesting the movement, exhaustion settling into his bones with the weight of 48 hours compressed into a crucible that had tested everything he'd thought he understood about power and justice and the distance between them. Sophia appeared as he gathered his messenger bag, her expression uncertain in a way that suggested she still hadn't quite processed her promotion, still expected someone to announce it had all been a mistake or a test that she'd somehow failed. "Mr. Bennett, the crew hotel has a room prepared for you if you need rest before your connection, or I can arrange car service to wherever you're staying in Chicago." Marcus checked his watch and did the arithmetic on exhaustion versus urgency, weighing the cost of pushing through against the cost of delay and ultimately deciding that some things mattered more than physical comfort or medical prudence. "I need to go to Skylink's headquarters downtown. There's work that can't wait for daylight." The drive from O'Hare took 30 minutes through streets that were empty enough to make good time but not so deserted that the city felt abandoned, just sleeping, waiting for dawn to animate the machinery of commerce that defined modern American urban centers. Marcus sat in the back of a black car that smelled like leather and air freshener, watching the skyline grow larger through the windshield, watching the Skylink Airways building emerge from the cluster of towers that housed the corporate infrastructure of airlines and consulting firms, and all the other entities that made money by moving things or people or information from one place to another. The building's lobby was marble and glass and the kind of aggressive modernism that architects deployed when they wanted structures to announce corporate power through geometry and scale. Security nodded him through after checking ID that identified him as the new owner, though the guard's expression suggested the late-night news cycle hadn't yet penetrated to lobby staff. That Marcus was still just another executive arriving at odd hours rather than the person whose face was currently attached to videos being shared millions of times across platforms that specialized in viral outrage. The elevator rose 37 floors in silence, broken only by the mechanical hum of cables and counterweights, acceleration pressing Marcus's exhausted body down, before deceleration lifted it toward the executive suite where Rebecca Stone had assembled a crisis response team that had been working since the ground stop, since the first reports filtered through airport operations that something unprecedented was developing at JFK. The doors opened onto a reception area where Skylink's logo dominated one wall in brushed steel letters 3 feet tall, corporate branding that would need reimagining along with everything else, along with the culture and policies and institutional assumptions that had allowed tonight to happen. Rebecca met him at the elevator with coffee and concern, her tablet tucked under one arm and exhaustion written across features that suggested she'd aged 5 years in the past 4 hours, that running an airline while its new owner got arrested on one of its aircraft created stresses that normal operations couldn't approach. Medical called from JFK. You refuse stitches and imaging. They're recommending you get evaluated by a physician before making any major decisions, given the head trauma and the hours you've been awake. Marcus took the coffee and drank it black, the bitterness cutting through fatigue enough to sharpen focus that had started drifting toward edges of consciousness. Sleep could wait. Medical attention could wait. Right now, he needed to understand exactly what he'd purchased, needed to see the full scope of the problem before designing solutions that would survive contact with institutional resistance. Show me the complaint database. Everything going back 5 years filtered for incidents involving passenger removal or seating disputes in premium cabins. The conference room had been transformed into a war room, laptops and monitors covering the table's surface, whiteboards filled with timelines and org charts and the kind of analytical frameworks that consultants deployed when problems proved too complex for simple solutions. 3 people looked up as Marcus entered, their expressions mixing curiosity with wariness, uncertain whether the new owner would blame them for systemic failures or recognize that individual employees rarely controlled the cultures they inhabited. The woman closest to Marcus stood and extended her hand, with the confidence of someone senior enough to not be intimidated by ownership changes. Her name tag identifying her as Sarah Kim, VP of Customer Experience, though her exhausted appearance suggested experience was currently teaching brutal lessons about the gap between policy and practice. Mr. Bennett, I've compiled the data you requested. The pattern is worse than our initial assessment suggested. She touched a keyboard and the main monitor filled with a spreadsheet containing rows that extended beyond what the screen could display. Each line representing an incident, a complaint, a passenger who'd been questioned or challenged or removed because someone in authority had decided they didn't belong based on criteria that had nothing to do with tickets or documentation or actual policy. Marcus leaned forward, ignoring the throb in his temple, scanning the data for patterns that algorithms would quantify but that human judgment could recognize first. 47 incidents in the past 4 years, just as his app had indicated. But Sarah's deeper analysis revealed connections his code had missed. Relationships between incidents that suggested coordination or at least shared cultural assumptions that propagated through training and example and the gradual accumulation of precedent that turned prejudice into procedure. Christine Morrison appeared in 31 of the 47 incidents, either as direct participant or as supervisor approving actions taken by subordinates. Captain Hayes appeared in 14, always siding with crew over passengers, always prioritizing operational convenience over individual rights, always treating challenges to his authority as justification for escalation. But the pattern extended beyond two individuals. Regional VP Jennifer Drake had dismissed 43 of the 47 complaints as unsubstantiated or resolved through appropriate channels, which apparently meant vouchers and apologies rather than addressing the underlying behaviors that generated complaints. The training department had designed bias awareness modules, but implementation was voluntary and completion rates hovered around 12%. HR had documented concerns from multiple employees about discriminatory practices, but taken no action beyond adding notes to personnel files that nobody reviewed until incidents became lawsuits. These 18 cases here, Marcus pointed at a cluster of incidents from 2022. What was the resolution? Sarah's expression suggested she'd been dreading this question, that the answer revealed failures too systematic to explain away as isolated oversights or individual bad actors making decisions that contradicted institutional values. Settlement agreements with confidentiality clauses. The passengers received monetary compensation ranging from $5,000 to $40,000 depending on severity. In exchange, they signed ND, as preventing them from discussing the incidents publicly or pursuing further legal action. Legal characterized it as cost-effective risk management. Cost-effective risk management. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for years. While people pretended not to smell it, while quarterly earnings reports showed profits and customer satisfaction surveys showed acceptable ratings and everything looked fine from altitude, even as individual passengers absorbed indignities that settlement checks could compensate financially but couldn't undo experientially. Marcus pulled out his phone and started taking notes, names and dates and dollar amounts that would become evidence in the transformation he was planning. Ammunition for board meetings and policy debates and the inevitable resistance that would emerge when comfortable people realized change meant discomfort, meant accountability, meant surrendering the authority to act on prejudice without consequence. I want contact information for every passenger in these 18 settled cases, not to contest the agreements but to offer them something settlement couldn't provide. Sarah looked confused, her exhaustion making it harder to anticipate where Marcus was heading. What purpose could be served by reopening matters that legal had considered closed and resolved according to standard corporate practice for minimizing exposure while admitting no wrongdoing? What are you offering them? Testimony, a platform, the chance to have their experiences documented and validated publicly instead of buried under confidentiality agreements that protected the airline's reputation at the cost of their dignity. We're going to void the NDAs and invite them to participate in the investigation, to help us understand patterns that individual incidents only hint at. Rebecca had been silent during the data review, but now she stepped forward with her tablet displaying what looked like legal opinions, rendered in dense paragraphs that probably concluded such action would violate binding contracts and expose Skylink to liability that settlement agreements had been designed to prevent. Mr. Bennett, our legal team is strongly advising against unilaterally voiding NDAs. The precedent would be significant, and other parties might argue their settlements should be revisited as well if we're establishing that confidentiality clauses can be ignored when convenient. Marcus drained his coffee and set the empty cup on the conference table with enough force that everyone in the room looked at him, their attention sharpening despite the late hour, despite the exhaustion that made thinking feel like moving through mud. I'm not ignoring the clauses because they're inconvenient. I'm voiding them because they were fundamentally unjust, because we paid people to stay silent about discrimination rather than addressing the discrimination itself. If other settlement recipients want their cases reopened, good, let's reopen them. Let's put every failure under scrutiny harsh enough that whatever survives will actually deserve to exist. The words created a silence that extended beyond the conference room, rippling outward through implications that would reshape how Skylink Airways approached liability and reputation, and the careful balance between protecting the institution and protecting the individuals it served. Sarah was typing rapidly on her laptop, already drafting communication strategies for contacting settled passengers, already anticipating the logistics of coordinating testimony from people scattered across the country who'd accepted payments specifically to avoid reliving their experiences. We should expect media attention to intensify once word spreads that we're reopening these cases. The videos from tonight are already approaching 10 million views across platforms, and major outlets are requesting interviews with you, with Rebecca, with anyone who can provide context beyond what the footage shows. Marcus nodded, acknowledging the reality that his personal incident had become public property, that the next weeks would involve cameras and questions and the kind of scrutiny that turned private citizens into public figures whether they wanted the transformation or not. But media attention could be useful if channeled properly, if converted from spectacle into education, if the outrage that drove clicks and shares could be redirected toward demanding systemic change rather than just punishing individual offenders. No interviews until the investigation is complete, but we'll release preliminary findings as we develop them, show the public what we're learning about how these systems fail and what we're doing to fix them. Transparency without spin, data without corporate messaging diluting the impact. Rebecca looked like she wanted to argue, wanted to deploy every communication strategy she'd learned over 20 years in corporate crisis management. But something in Marcus's expression made her swallow the objections and simply nod. This wasn't a crisis to be managed through careful messaging and strategic silence. This was a reckoning that required exposure rather than protection, that needed harsh light rather than controlled narrative. The monitors around the conference room cycled through various news sites, each showing versions of tonight's footage with headlines that competed for the most dramatic framing. Billionaire CEO arrested on his own airline. Shocking video shows passenger bleeding after forced removal. Skylink Airways grounds all flights after discrimination incident. The coverage would intensify over coming days as reporters dug into histories and patterns, as talking heads debated whether Marcus had overreacted by grounding 43 aircraft, as legal experts analyzed whether the arrest constituted false imprisonment or excessive force or merely unfortunate misunderstanding. Let them debate. Let the conversation expand beyond this single incident, to examine all the others, to question why these patterns existed, to demand accountability from institutions that had spent decades perfecting the art of avoiding it. Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from his head of legal confirming that all security footage from JFK Terminal 5 for the past 5 years had been preserved and was being uploaded to secure servers for analysis. The next buzz brought preliminary results from algorithmic review of the footage. Pattern recognition software identifying instances where passengers of color were subjected to additional screening or questioning at rates that defied statistical randomness, that proved systematic bias even when no individual incident rose to the level of obvious discrimination. The data would be damning. The patterns would be undeniable. The evidence would survive any attempt at reinterpretation or excuse-making, would stand as permanent record of institutional failure that had damaged hundreds of passengers over years of operation under multiple ownership structures and leadership teams. Sarah cleared her throat with the hesitance of someone about to deliver news that would complicate already complex situations, her expression suggesting she'd discovered something in the data that Marcus needed to know immediately, even though he probably wouldn't want to hear it. Mr. Bennett, there's one additional pattern in the complaint data that we need to address. The incidents aren't limited to Skylink Airways. Cross-referencing our settled cases with public records from other carriers shows similar patterns at Delta, United, American. The problem is industry-wide, not company-specific. The revelation should have been discouraging, should have suggested that fixing Skylink wouldn't actually solve anything, because passengers would simply encounter the same treatment on different aircraft wearing different uniforms. But Marcus felt something almost like relief, because industry-wide problems created opportunities for industry-wide solutions, created space for leadership that could reshape entire sectors rather than just individual companies. Then we'll fix the industry. Start with Skylink, prove the model works, demonstrate that treating passengers with dignity actually improves both moral outcomes and business metrics. Once we have proof of concept, we take it to the FAA. Push for regulatory changes that make our policies mandatory across all carriers. Rebecca was shaking her head, not in disagreement, but in something closer to awe or disbelief. The recognition that Marcus wasn't thinking about quarterly earnings or stock price, but about using capital and authority to force change at scales that most CEOs never attempted. Because ambition that large required patience measured in years and tolerance for conflict that extended beyond normal corporate risk appetite. The conference room door opened and a man in his late 50s entered carrying a medical bag, his expression suggesting he'd been summoned urgently and wasn't pleased about the late hour or the circumstances. The name embroidered on his jacket identified him as Dr. Raymond Torres, and the way Rebecca greeted him suggested he was Skylink's corporate physician, the person responsible for ensuring executives remained functional despite the stress and travel and accumulated damage that came with running an airline. Mr. Bennett, I understand you've been refusing medical attention for a head wound that required law enforcement intervention. I'm here to evaluate whether you're actually capable of making decisions, or whether you're operating with a concussion that's compromising your judgment. Marcus submitted to examination because arguing with doctors was futile, and because part of him recognized that Torres was right, that the throb in his temple and the exhaustion making his thoughts feel sluggish might indicate actual injury rather than just fatigue and stress. The physician worked efficiently, checking pupil response and balance and asking questions designed to assess cognitive function while simultaneously evaluating whether his patient was stable enough to continue working or needed immediate hospitalization. You have a mild concussion, though the head wound itself is superficial despite the dramatic bleeding. I'm recommending 48 hours of rest with someone monitoring you for deteriorating symptoms. If you insist on continuing to work tonight, I need written acknowledgement that you're acting against medical advice. Marcus signed the form that Torres produced from his bag, documentation that would protect the physician from liability while allowing Marcus to continue the investigation that couldn't wait for brain trauma to heal or exhaustion to lift through sleep that kept getting deferred in favor of more urgent priorities. The sky outside the conference room windows was beginning to lighten, that gradual transition from black to deep blue that preceded dawn, the city below still mostly dark but starting to show signs of the coming day. Marcus had been awake for 57 hours straight now, powered by coffee and adrenaline and the kind of focus that emerged when purpose aligned with capacity. When the right person found themselves in the right position at the right moment to actually fix something that had been broken for too long. His phone buzzed again, this time with a notification that the video of his arrest had crossed 20 million views. That hashtag Skylink discrimination was trending globally. That the internet had rendered its verdict with the speed and fury that digital mobs brought to anything that confirmed their existing beliefs about injustice and power, and the systems that protected one while perpetuating the other. Sarah was monitoring social media reaction on multiple screens, her expression cycling between satisfaction at the public outrage and concern about backlash that might emerge once the initial wave of support exhausted itself and contrarian voices started questioning Marcus's motives or methods, or whether grounding 43 aircraft had been reasonable response or dramatic overreaction. The sentiment analysis is running 92% supportive currently, though we're seeing some pushback from aviation industry groups questioning whether ownership gave you authority to unilaterally ground operations without FAA approval. They're suggesting the ground stop might have violated regulations about airline safety and operational control. Marcus had anticipated this angle, had prepared for the argument that his actions had been excessive or procedurally improper, even if morally justified. The FAA would conduct its own investigation, would review the ground stop and determine whether it had been legally authorized or whether Marcus had overstepped boundaries that separated owners from operators, shareholders from managers, people with capital from people with regulatory authority. Let them investigate. The ground stop was issued through proper channels using my authority as majority shareholder and acting CEO, executed by the existing COO using standard emergency protocols. If the FAA determines we violated regulations, we'll pay whatever fines they assess. But I'm not apologizing for stopping operations after my own employees had me arrested and assaulted. The words would become a quote, would be extracted from whatever interview eventually happened and repeated in articles and social media posts, would crystallize the fundamental question about whether Marcus's response had been proportional to the offense, or whether power had been deployed in ways that felt satisfying but ultimately served ego more than justice. Time would tell. The investigation would reveal whether grounding 43 aircraft had been necessary to force accountability, or whether it had been theater, spectacle designed to maximize personal vindication at the cost of thousands of delayed passengers and millions of dollars in operational disruption. Rebecca was fielding calls from board members who'd been woken by news alerts, who wanted explanations for why their airline was trending globally for reasons that had nothing to do with service quality or route expansion or any of the normal metrics that measured corporate success. Her answers were brief and professional, acknowledging their concerns while deferring substantive discussion until the emergency board meeting that would convene later this morning, until everyone had time to review the footage and data and understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. The sun finally crept above the horizon, golden light spilling across Chicago's skyline and through the conference room windows, illuminating faces that hadn't seen darkness give way to dawn in the same physical location, that had worked through the night on problems that refused to resolve quickly or easily or in ways that satisfied everyone involved. Marcus felt the exhaustion settling deeper now that daylight had arrived, his body recognizing that night was supposed to mean sleep, that 57 hours of continuous consciousness wasn't sustainable regardless of how much coffee or adrenaline got deployed to maintain function. But there was one more thing that needed handling before he could surrender to the physical demands his body kept making. One more conversation that would determine whether the transformation he envisioned could actually happen, or whether institutional resistance would grind good intentions into dust. I want to speak with Dr. William Parker, Maria Santos, James Wilson, and the elderly couple who were moved from first class in 2020. Not through lawyers, not through official channels. I want to sit across from them and hear their stories directly, understand what this system cost them in ways that complaint forms and settlement checks can't capture. Sarah nodded, already drafting the outreach messages that would travel through lawyers and agents to reach people who'd been paid to forget their experiences with Skylink Airways, who'd signed agreements promising slints, in exchange for money that probably seemed significant at the time, but couldn't compensate for the humiliation of being publicly questioned about whether they belonged in spaces they'd paid to occupy. The conference room door opened again and a woman Marcus didn't recognize entered carrying breakfast from somewhere that was apparently open at dawn. Bagels and fruit and the kind of catering that corporate crisis management teams consumed while dealing with disasters that couldn't be resolved during normal business hours. She distributed food with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, who understood that feeding exhausted executives was part of the infrastructure that kept airlines functioning through the crises that punctuated normal operations. Marcus accepted a bagel he wouldn't eat, and coffee he definitely would, his appetite suppressed by exhaustion and pain medication and the knowledge that breakfast meant acknowledging the new day had arrived, meant facing whatever consequences and revelations the next 24 hours would bring. The monitor showing social media sentiment had shifted slightly, the support percentage dropping from 92 to 87 as early critics began questioning whether Marcus had manufactured the incident for publicity, whether someone planning to buy an airline would really dress in a hoodie and fly economy class casual, unless they were deliberately provoking confrontation. The conspiracy theories would proliferate regardless of evidence, would persist in corners of the internet where skepticism toward authority figures and distrust of wealth created reflexive suspicion about any narrative that positioned billionaires as victims rather than villains. Let them doubt, let them question. The security footage and multiple camera angles and testimony from witnesses who had no stake in the outcome would establish truth for anyone actually interested in evidence rather than confirmation of pre-existing beliefs. Rebecca approached with her tablet displaying an email that had just arrived from Port Authority Police. Formal notification that officers Cooper and Turner had been placed on administrative leave pending internal investigation into the use of force during Marcus's removal. That their body camera footage and incident reports had been preserved as evidence. That the department was taking the allegations of excessive force seriously and would conduct a thorough review according to established protocols. Standard bureaucratic language that promised accountability while avoiding commitment to specific outcomes, that acknowledged concerns while preserving maximum flexibility to determine later that policy had been followed and training had been adequate, and the officers had made reasonable decisions given the information available to them at the time. Marcus had seen enough of these investigations to know how they usually ended, had watched enough cases of police violence get resolved through paid leave and token discipline, and eventual return to duty with records that showed no wrongdoing despite video evidence suggesting otherwise. But this case had visibility that most didn't, had millions of witnesses instead of dozens, had documentation so thorough that alternative interpretations would require denying obvious reality. When the Port Authority investigation concludes regardless of their findings, I want to file a civil suit against Cooper and Turner personally for assault and violation of civil rights. Not for the money, but to establish legal precedent that might protect the next person who gets dragged off an aircraft for the crime of not matching someone's expectations. Rebecca made notes on her tablet, documenting instructions that would become action items for legal teams that would spend the next months or years navigating court systems that moved at speeds inversely proportional to the urgency of the injustices they were meant to remedy. Civil suits took time, required patience that Marcus usually lacked, demanded faith that justice would eventually emerge from processes designed more for thoroughness than speed. But some things were worth waiting for. Some precedents mattered enough to justify the cost and delay and uncertainty of litigation that might ultimately fail but would at least force the questions into public record, would at least make the next officer think twice before assuming compliance could be compelled through force simply because a captain or flight attendant had decided someone didn't belong. The morning deepened, sunlight filling the conference room with warmth that did nothing to dispel the exhaustion, making Marcus's thoughts feel increasingly disconnected from the words coming out of his mouth. Dr. Torres was watching him with the clinical attention that physicians brought to patients who were pushing physical limits past the point of reasonable safety, whose determination to continue working was beginning to cross from dedication into something closer to self-harm. "Mr. Bennett, I'm strongly recommending you stop now and get at least 6 hours of sleep before the board meeting. Your cognitive function is deteriorating, and continuing to make major decisions while concussed and sleep-deprived significantly increases the risk of errors that will be difficult to reverse later." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist that sleep could wait until the investigation reached some natural pause point, until the pattern analysis was complete, and the victim interviews were scheduled and the policy changes were drafted in sufficient detail to survive contact with implementation. But his body was betraying him now. Exhaustion making his hands tremble when he lifted the coffee cup, making his vision blur at the edges when he tried to focus on the monitors displaying data that should have been comprehensible but was starting to look like abstract patterns without meaning. 6 hours, then the board meeting. Then we continue the investigation until we've documented every failure and designed solutions for each one. Rebecca nodded with visible relief. Had probably been waiting hours for Marcus to acknowledge his physical limitations, had been preparing arguments about why rest was necessary that she hadn't needed to deploy because stubbornness eventually ran into biological constraints that couldn't be overcome through willpower or caffeine or sense of urgency, however legitimate. The hotel was 3 blocks from Skylink's headquarters, corporate housing that the airline maintained for executives who needed to sleep between crisis management sessions. who lived in the space between airports and never quite established permanent residence anywhere. Marcus's room was generic luxury, the kind of studied neutrality that five-star hotels deployed to avoid offending anyone's taste while simultaneously failing to reflect anyone's actual preferences. Furniture that looked expensive but felt impersonal. Art on the walls that suggested culture without actually displaying any. He collapsed onto the bed, still wearing the blood-stained hoodie because removing it required more energy than he could currently summon. His last conscious thought, something about setting an alarm that would wake him in 6 hours for the board meeting where he'd have to defend the ground stop and the firings and the investigation he'd launched without consulting anyone who might have advised caution or moderation or the kind of strategic patience that preserved relationships at the cost of immediate justice. But Marcus had spent 23 years being patient, being strategic, waiting for the right moment to force change instead of demanding it immediately. Tonight, the moment had arrived through circumstances he hadn't chosen but wouldn't waste, through an incident that gave him authority to act on problems that had persisted for decades while people with power chose comfort over confrontation, chose institutional stability over individual dignity, chose silence over the kind of noise that made healing possible. Sleep took him under like a wave, dragging him down into darkness where Christine Morrison's voice kept echoing, where the click of handcuffs kept replaying, where the taste of blood kept filling his mouth no matter how many times he swallowed, where the pattern of 47 incidents kept expanding to show hundreds more, thousands more, an entire system built on assumptions about who belonged where and who deserved dignity and who could be dismissed without consequence. When the alarm woke him 6 hours later, the videos had reached 40 million views and counting, and the real work was only just beginning.